So Jim, first of all, thank you for joining me today at the 80/20 Strategy video shows. And I know we've been trying for a while to get this done, so I'm really glad that you could make out the time, and seems to be working really well.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So Jim, when you and I talked first, you told me things that were really interesting to hear, and I know for sure that the audience that I cater to would really enjoy hearing your story about how you sell, and what your experiences have been, what your lessons have been. So would you tell me briefly about what do you do?
Well, I am the CEO of Enterprise Management Group. We're a very small consulting company. Years ago, we started off providing interim CIO services, typically to large Fortune 500 companies. And it turned out that a process we had developed to reduce the cost of IT actually had application across the entire enterprise. So several years ago, we had the opportunity to apply our process to a very large insurance company that was a mutual insurance company, and they were hoping to go public, but they just couldn't reach their number. So we were involved in a large IT project there, and they put out a request for all the major consulting companies to do proposals to reduce costs. And because we were there and we knew our process had applicability beyond just the IT organization, we were allowed to participate. And I say allowed to participate because we're a relatively unknown company. All the other players were, the big five in the United States. So we did our brief little present.
And I thought you also mentioned that McKinsey was a part of as well over there, was it?
Not on this one, but in previous ones, yes. And we got the assignment. So in 8 weeks, having the client follow our process on an enterprise basis, we reduced their operating expense by $35 million. And they went public within the next 6 months. Once we saw that process applied to the enterprise, frankly, we lost interest in the IT stuff. It just didn't make sense anymore. If we could generate $35 million in savings in 8 weeks, we probably had something more valuable than IT consulting. So we basically deserted the whole IT offering and now focus only on large-scale expense reduction. And what that does to us is we are a relatively unknown consulting company, and we are so protective of our IP that we don't do any advertising or hardly any marketing at all. It's almost all referrals. My challenge that I have in selling, when you and I initiated our first conversation, is this process only works when it's sponsored by the CEO. We have done it without the CEO sponsorship, and the results were exponentially lower. So my sales challenge is, I'm unknown, I'm selling a process that is difficult to believe, and I am always selling against the most prestigious consulting companies in the country. So if I can get a appointment with the CEO and his staff, I have a very high close rate. So that's who EMG is, and our challenge is getting in front of the CEO. Yes, and I think in no small way it has to do with the fact that when you tell somebody you're going to reduce their operating expense by $300 million in 10 weeks, and your fees are completely tied to the results, that's actually too hard to believe. So what we have to do is, if we get the FaceTime, we basically have about a 10-page PowerPoint presentation where we tell the CEO, and it's usually the CEO and his direct reports, we tell them exactly what we're going to do, how much money it's going to save, how long it's going to take, what the fees will be, and how the process works. That typically takes 20 minutes. That 20 minutes and those 10 slides, almost without exception, generates an hour of questions. Because no one else they're talking to has proposed 10 weeks, improved morale, fees based on results. So it generates an awful lot of questions. So in the case that we initiated our conversation with, I'll never forget the feeling of walking into this massive corporate headquarters and going up to the reception desk and seeing a welcoming board there with the 5 biggest consulting companies in the United States, and second from the bottom was EMG. I could just imagine the other guys walking in and look at that and saying, who the heck is that? So I was the second to last to present. I completed the presentation as usual in 20 minutes. They took 50 minutes for questions, so we actually went 10 minutes over our hour. And they thanked me, and I left at 2 p.m. and headed to the airport. I got as far as the security checkpoint. My cell phone rang, and it was the chairman's secretary, and she asked me if I could come back. I'm sure every person who's ever done a sales presentation knows that's a very good sign. So I checked out of the airport, went back to the hotel. We had dinner that night and closed the sale. So in the 10 weeks following, we generated a $300 million reduction in SG&A, a $200 million reduction in already approved capital. I believe the inventory reduction value was a one-time hit of about $45 million. And somewhat noteworthy is they had already announced 3,000 layoffs complying with the WARN Act. That's what they figured they would have to do to get to the 300 million. We got to the 300 million in 10 weeks, and the 3,000 layoffs turned out to be 1,160. So while that's still an awful lot of jobs, it's a 60% reduction. While this was our largest client, the results at every client have been similar in scale. But again, going back to the original premise of this, the sales process is still very difficult.
Okay, so here's what I hear. You were previously doing interim CIO kind of work, and you bumped into this this thing that you had sitting, your value sitting behind you, unknown to you, let alone unknown to prospects or to clients or to buyers. And by serendipity, you realized, well, wait a minute, I got a boatload of value sitting behind me, and there I am not even aware of it, let alone selling it. So you went ahead and changed your approach, you changed your strategy. Now you said something that your close rate is really high, which is wonderful. Apparently you have true value and you're able to demonstrate your value to the CEO. And when they see the value, it's easy enough to conclude that that this is a good deal to go for, it seems, from what you're describing. Now, obviously your bottleneck, as you said, is in opening doors. So I want to get a little bit deeper into both those issues. Let me ask you this first of all. Your fees based on percentage of revenue, percentage of cost saved, right? Or margins increased.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
So in a second round, after the first success or the third or fourth successes, after that it should be easy for you to convince a CEO that, look, this is our process, this is your problem, this is likely the solution. You don't believe me, here are 3 clients that we have done work with and their testimonials. So is that the reason why your close rate is high, or are you not able to give your testimonials?
Oh no, I'm absolutely convinced that the close rate is as high as it is because of the uniqueness of the process and the enthusiasm of the references.
Okay, so great, that's wonderful. So you're sitting on the goose that lays the golden egg, so to speak. I mean, you know exactly what works, and you've got a great success rate, and nobody else is doing that. Typically, when people look at issues like this, they say, well, your marketing, which means how you communicate your value to prospects, there is an issue there. Now, you mentioned earlier on that your value proposition is your IP and you can't talk about it. Is that the reason you're not able to write a white paper or case studies and share it with prospects?
Yes, that's exactly right. And the unique thing about this process is it's so simple. That's why it's so difficult to sell. But the thing that I'm convinced that helps us close deals is our process involves no consulting whatsoever. 100% of the input that we end up presenting is attributed to the employees. So we take credit for absolutely nothing. And when they're making the decision, if you're a major consulting company and you're talking about $300 million, for example, you're going to have to look in every nook and cranny in that company to find $300 million. Then, when you're given this presentation, all the competitors that I'm going to run up against are going to have to bring in a rather large team of consultants. They're going to have to study things. They're going to have to come up with solutions. Once in hand, they're going to have to sell those solutions. The uniqueness of our process is that when something comes across our table, the action is taken that day or at the latest the next day. So we have tremendous volume of statistics, tens of thousands of instances, where we counted what percentage of those were fixing things versus what percentage was just stopping doing things. It's almost 80-20. So if you think, oh, of course you do. But if you think about it, it's not even reasonable to suppose that a major corporation that's been in business for 20 or 30 years could not have a lot of things sitting around which were brilliant ideas when they were implemented. They grew, they became part of the culture, but they have long outlived their usefulness or value. Employees see that every single day. What they need is a risk-free environment to talk about that. And that's what we provide them with. So when I'm selling against the traditional consulting model, I'm telling the CEO he's going to know in 4 weeks how the project's going. In that case of the large power company we talked about earlier, at the end of 4 weeks, they had already reduced their annual run rate by $90 million. So the reason I got that high close rate, the CIO looks at me, or CEO rather, looks at me and sees, here's that presentation. No knows that he can check the references, and knows that he's going to know whether this thing is successful in as little as 4 weeks, and he's not paying anything to get there.
Accepting that he has to give his personal interest and time, because otherwise you said it doesn't happen.
Yes. Yeah, we tracked his time over 10 years, and it's about 20 hours over the course of the 10 weeks. But when the CEO, as I said earlier, doesn't sponsor this, the officers tend not to take it very seriously. And that's what I need. So we will no longer do an assignment without the support of the CEO. In fact, our project begins with the production of a 5-minute video of the CEO announcing to the employees what we're about to do and what his role is going to be. If you can imagine doing that with someone other than the CEO, the message to the employees is completely different.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, that's what gets people going. Otherwise, you may have the grandest of all plans. The team is not bought into the idea, whichever it is. And so that vision of the CEO, if he buys or she buys into it, needs to be communicated, because you're going to work with the rest of the organization. So I completely see that. In fact, it ties in with some of the things that I promote. And since we talked about 80-20, you know, most of the things, when we start breaking them down, processes, and look at things and say, how is the 80-20 principle in operation here? You can identify the 20% of the key things that really produce the biggest bang. And as long as we focus on those, that tends to garner results. So what kind of organizations does your process work with? Is it across the board any kind? But what about size, industries? You know, how do you segment?
We typically don't go much below $1 billion in SG&A. It's just as difficult for us to save $300 million as it is to save $20 million. It still takes 10 weeks, it takes fewer staff, but the elapsed time is the same and the reward is exponentially lower. So we typically target that.
Okay, so I understand 10 weeks and a team, so you've got some cost associated with it, but if you had to do this for $100 million company, which will reduce your revenue, your company's revenue, EMG's revenue by 90%, would this be doable, or would this not be doable?
Yes, I did a .com one time because it allowed me to stay in Seattle with my family for 8 weeks. So our target was only $10 million. And it only took 2 of us, and our fees were high enough that it made it worthwhile. But the best answer to your question is it's an opportunity cost situation. If there was nothing else going on and we were going to do a $100 million company, it would make sense. If I could backtrack just a little bit, we were talking earlier about the employee motivation and needing the CEO's sponsorship. We have a phrase that we use from a book that was written probably 10 or 15 years ago called "Sacred Cows Make the Best Burgers." And the key ingredient to our process is identifying what to the employees is a sacred cow and having the CEO do something about that quickly in the project. In the large example I quoted earlier, the airplanes were the sacred cow. A lot of the airplanes, the jets. If you're going to lay off 3,000 people and the executives are flying around the country in a fleet of jets, it's really hard to get the employees to take you seriously. Well, throughout our first 3 weeks, that was the biggest item. So here's an interesting statistic about what happens with this process. At the end of 3 weeks, we had 800 inputs from employees. That's out of 23,000 employees. At the end of the third week, the CEO saw those suggestions and the reasoning that the employees were using for why the jets were such an insult when you're laying off 3,000 people. He made a very bold decision and put the jets up for sale. That announcement was made on a Tuesday, as I recall, after the market closed. 800 suggestions on that day. 7 business days later, we had 7,400 inputs. It took my team of 10 almost 3 days just to open the envelopes and sort them. And that 7,400 generated $300 million in SG&A reduction. And we're only paid on the sustainable reductions. So since our program is called Sustained Earnings Improvement, we can't be taking credit for capital savings or one-time savings because those don't impact earnings.
Wonderful. Right. Many people will say, well, sales lesson from this is to sell something that people want to buy. Actually, that's actually a wonderful idea to be able to say that. There's not much point in focusing your energies on selling something that people don't want to buy, but so many companies with certain businesses of theirs continue to do that. I think that's a very simple lesson. And I am all for simplicity. So I completely see what you're saying.
I'll tell you that I've heard on numerous occasions this phrase that drives me crazy: it's too good to be true. Now, I would think that selling something that's too good to be true would be easy. It's just not.
There's a process. I often compare the idea of I'm from Texas, so barbecue is a big thing. You cannot take a piece of meat and nuke it. You've got to go through the process. It doesn't matter how good your sales proposition is. You still have to go through the process, and companies need to, salespeople need to understand and respect the process, because it doesn't matter how good the stuff is, you've got to go through the process. And sales is about an education. People have preconceived notions. You have to wipe clean their whiteboards and rewrite your message, and it takes time. So I completely see when you say that, I can close it if I get to the whiteboard, but until that point, nobody's wanting to listen to me. And so there are, and that's another story, completely different story, how to open doors. And another thing that comes out is selling to the top boss. It's very important to sell to the top boss in charge of the specific issue. If you're selling janitorial supplies, then you probably need not go to the VP of something, but you've got somebody who's responsible for office care, and he has a P&L responsibility. The guy who's got the P&L responsibility of the function that you're fixing or improving, that's the one that you need to be very careful of. So you need to go to the top boss, this big honcho, who's the final word on all the stuff that you are promoting or selling or whatever it is that you're doing. And until you do that, your success chances are significantly reduced. So in your case, it's a company-wide proposition. It's not something tied to a division or a particular silo. It's across the board, and therefore it's important to go to the CEO, otherwise it doesn't work. And that's one of the lessons I think it's critical to understand. Now, how do you do that? There are all kinds of theories, but evidently from what you are saying is that once you get the ears of the CEO and you're able to talk in his or her language, you're able to communicate the value proposition in a manner that he or she values, then your conversion rate is high. And I want to dig deeper into that. Do you pretend, do you have to sell? Do you have to go multiple times and convince the CEO, or is it that something, once you get an opportunity, the big decision maker is quick to see the value and they move quickly on that? The bosses don't dilly-dally.
That's really a good question. I never thought about that. No, I've never gone more than once. I actually never thought about that.
And that is something that based on a bunch of people that I talk to and work with, CEOs that I work with, I've realized exactly what it takes, because these people are obviously hard pressed for time and looking for results. If you can demonstrate, they don't dilly-dally. Unlike the middle managers, they are not necessarily looking at certain numbers as the ones that will derive or drive their success rate. They're looking at, hey, how can I make my boss look good? How can I keep my seat warm? You know, they've got many other motivations besides the P&L. Whereas a P&L manager is strictly looking at P&L. So that's why when you go to a P&L manager and he looks at it and he says, look, I'm judged by my numbers, and you can really help me with my numbers, I'll go forward with it.
Well, that's a critical part of our presentation, is that we tell the CEO at the end of this process, there'll be no question in his mind which of his middle managers understand their role in supporting the P&L. You know, you were right. Middle managers tend to want to be a lot more concerned about the culture and whose toes might I step on. And we put them in sometimes a very uncomfortable position. We'll be in a meeting where an idea is being suggested and it's clearly viable. And typically middle managers will want to end the meeting and go off and do other things and get back to this. And our rule is no. If it's a bad idea to be spending that money today, it's a much worse idea to be spending it tomorrow after we've already agreed that it's bad. So throughout this process, of that 7,400 inputs that I mentioned before, 3,900 were executed. Well, you can't have a big bang of 3,000 implementations. So every single day when you find something that no longer makes sense, you have to deal with it. So your prior comment about being in front of the CEO, I feel pretty comfortable when I'm there because I have great references and what I'm selling is quick. He'll know within a month whether the thing is working or not. And I think it's almost disarming to some CEOs that we're putting our fees at risk, especially with such huge numbers.
Jim, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with you.
I enjoyed this opportunity, Nick. Have a great day.